Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming in on such a gorgeous day to spend some time indoors with us here. My name is Gwyn Roberts. I'm one of the co-directors of Tempesta di Mare, and I'm here to tell you some of the stories of the people behind this music. And by that, I don't mean the composers, which seems to be what we always mean when we're talking about the people behind the music. If you think about it, there have always been many more people, many more different kinds of people behind music than just the composers. It's one thing to put the notes down on paper. It's quite another thing to perform it, to interpret it with your colleagues, to decide that you enjoy something so much that you tell your neighbors and friends about it, that you become a tastemaker, to transmit the music forward. There are so many different people and different kinds of people involved in music through time than we tend to think about. So, I'm here tonight, or this afternoon, to talk about two amazing women. The first of them that I'll introduce you to was named Santa della Pietà. And that her given name is Santa. She was dropped off as an infant about a half hour after birth, wrapped in burlap rags in the scaffetta, which was the drop box on the front wall of the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice. This is one of 4 institutions that were part of Venice's social safety net that had dated back centuries, but by the 18th century, they were also the hotbeds of musical performance in Venice, and the performers were women. In the Pietà, there was a large ensemble of singers and players of all of the instruments, which is quite exciting. And because they were women, they performed from behind screens. So they were not seen by the people who had come from all over Europe to hear them perform. Santa was dropped off, as I said, as an infant on the day that she was born, and given that name upon arrival. She grew up, as everybody did in that institution, first fostered by a family, either in Venice itself or on the mainland, and then grown up through her toddlerhood and her early childhood, during which time she was screened for musical talent. And she was lucky enough to pass through that screen and enter into the training program for musicians, where she excelled as a singer. She was already having prominent roles in the ensemble as a young teenager, and must have caught the ear, I can't say the eye because, screens, but must have caught the ear of one particular gentleman in the audience, because at the age of 18, she was caught canoodling in the garden behind the Pietà with Mr. Tosca in the bushes. There were 2 lookouts, 2 of her friends who were not from the musical side of the Pietà, but rather common women from the Pietà. And they were not very good lookouts because everybody got caught. And that meant that everybody went to prison. There was a prison in the basement of the Pietà, and all 3 of the young women wound up there. Mr. Tosca, however, who was also caught, was given a choice that he could either be banished from Venice permanently or marry her. And he decided he wanted to marry her. There's normally a pledge that you have to sign if you have married a woman from the Ospedale. And that pledge is that you will not allow her to go on stage as a singer. So he was asked to sign this pledge, and he said, I don't need to sign that pledge. I've got a ton of money. Why would I need her to go on the stage and support me? And somehow that worked. So he didn't sign the pledge. And he married her. And guess what she wanted to do? She wanted to go onto the stage. Do you have, any of you, this little thing? Yeah, take a look at it. And on one side at the bottom, it says Santina. This is amazing. This is pretty much the only named portrait that we have from the early 18th century of any of the female performers from any of the four ospedali. And this is, of course, after she has left. How can we tell? Well, check out what she's wearing. She is wearing a hat with a plume. She's wearing a dress that not only has all these fancy embroideries and patterns on it, but also you can see that she's wearing some structured stays underneath that are making her have a tiny waist. She's got a full skirt with crinolines and presumably some hooping going on underneath there. She's got a fan, and my favorite detail is if you check out at the bottom, she's wearing very fashionable pointy-toed shoes. So she is dressed up for a party. And presumably that's one of the places where she, like even people who were still in the ospedali, could perform in Venice without exciting any of the people who didn't want them to go on the stage, because it's a private party. You can see in the upper corner of this image, it says Santina della Pietà. So as a person from the Pietà, she didn't have a last name because, of course, she was abandoned as a baby. So they all went by the name of their institution, or sometimes by what they did. She could also be called Santina Cantora, for singer. And it says, Presente moglie dal Tasca, currently the wife of Tasca. And kind of an amazing thing happened. She wanted to go onto the stage, and he wanted to do that with her, for her. So they moved to London. And once they were in London, they encountered two composers that she already knew from her time at the Ospedale. One of them was Veracini, who had been back and forth between Dresden and Venice as a violinist. And the other one was Porpora, who was a composer who worked both at the Pietà, where he was considered scandalously too modern, and at the Incurabili, which was another one where he was considered just about right. And when she got to London, they each wrote roles for her. So this first piece that we have for Santina, that Meg Bregel, or Santina tonight, is going to sing for us, is from an opera that Veracini wrote that had already existed when she showed up in London, but he wrote a new role specifically for her. So this is her London debut. Later in this half, we will also hear an aria by Porpora. Our other heroine today is Faustina Bordoni, and she was about 18 years older than Santina, but also from Venice, where she was born not into an orphanage, but into a noble family, and she received an excellent musical education, as did Santina, I must say. The musical education at the Ospedali was fantastic. But Faustina has a very different career trajectory from Santina. She had a much longer career. She had a much more fame-ridden career than Santina did. Her fame extended beyond the shores of wherever she was. If you go down this direction on Germantown Avenue to St. Paul's Church, and you go into the front of the church, the main door, and take a look to your right, you will see on the wall a large brass engraved plaque with a woman playing a lute somehow on the top corner, and that is dedicated to Faustina Bordoni Hodges, who was an organist in the 19th century at that church, named obviously for Faustina Bordoni, which is quite the phenomenon to encounter here in Chestnut Hill. I nearly lost my cookies when I saw that. It was amazing. So Faustina's career was miraculous in many ways. Her big first splash was also in London, but as Handel's diva. A good 10 years or so prior to Santina's arrival, in the same theater, when Handel was with his company in residence there. By the time Santina arrived, it was a different company in residence that she was working with. But Faustina also excited a lot of stories about her. She was famous. People made up the idea that she and Cuzzoli, another star of the time, had to be, terrible, terrible fighting rivals. When in fact that's probably not quite the case. They were friends, but you gotta keep the public happy, And the public that came to operas came with their friends and their family and their picnics, and liked to take sides and cheer. The first aria that we have for Faustina is by a composer named Torri. I should mention that every time you read something about Faustina, it mentions in the first sentence that she was married to the composer Hasse. And I feel like I should point out that that was a much later in life marriage for her and for him, and that in fact she was way more famous than he was, both at the time they met and for the rest of their lives. So before you lose track of that little piece of paper with Santina's portrait on one side, turn it over for a second and you'll see a caricature of Faustina Bordoni. And you'll notice that the dress that they have on is very similar. The hair with the hat with the plumes on it is also very similar. But the facial affect is a little bit different, right? What we see on Santina is somebody who is looking up, and I like to imagine that she is amazed by her surroundings. She also has very prominent pockmarks, which are a natural result of having grown up in a communal living situation in a city that had many different kinds of pox active at the time. Faustina, of course, does not have such a problem. She's also depicted here as being very much an imperious woman in control. And she was renowned for her agility as a singer, for her pitch, for her ornamentation and articulation as a singer, and also for her acting. The next piece we have for Santina is actually, unfortunately, not for Santina, and that is a result of a cyber attack at the British Library back in 2023, which took their online resources offline, and they're still recovering from it. So the only source that exists for Polifemo by Porpora from London at this time is in their collection, and they're not responding to requests. I imagine they have a mountain at this point. So what we have instead is an aria from the same opera for Farinelli, who was the leading man. There's several things going on in here. First of all, the reason why we have this and not Santina's aria is this phenomenon of the Walsh print. John Walsh was the biggest music publisher in London at this point in the 18th century, and he was a great marketer. Among many other things, he would publish play-at-home or sing-at-home versions of your favorite tunes from whatever the hit show was in town at the time, kind of like taking home your original cast album of The Sound of Music or something, right? So there is the most favored songs from the opera Polifemo by Porpora, which survives, with the songs that were written for the leading man, Farinelli, and the leading woman, who was Cuzzoli. So this fits, so we'll do it, which is lovely. I will also point out that there's a couple other layers here. We talked about Santina and being forbidden to be on the stage. It wasn't only people from the Ospedali who had to consider that being on stage maybe was not consistent with the propriety of your religious upbringing. It was women in general. If you were a star of the stage, you might be renowned and admired and famous, but you wouldn't be invited to somebody's country home for the weekend. Being on stage was considered to be not quite proper for a woman. And so there's this little bit of a class system going on that if you are a female performer, there's something not quite appropriate about you. And this is borne out in so many accounts at the time of men observing women or hearing women perform and remarking on their ugliness. There was a way of being comfortable saying bad things about women's appearances, even though they were performing for you. Just going to leave that there. It's also true, though, for the castrati, that there was a certain exclusion from society for them, for some of the reasons you might imagine, but one reason that is also there for the castrati is they might sleep with your wife, and there would be no pregnancy complications. So there's that as well going on with the castrati, despite their also being very famous. So London in the 1720s was the first flowering of Faustina's career, working for Handel. If you notice, Santina's career began in the middle of the 1730s. And by the time she was 35, she retired voluntarily. But before then, she had a stint of time when she was actually the leading lady. And this piece by Leo represents one of those triumphs for her. This is her debut as a leading lady in an opera. I just have one small, cool, last thing to tell you about. And that is, if you notice in the program, the accompagnato and the aria that are the final items for Faustina are not from the same opera. And when I went looking for the source material for this, I could find these two items, which are often listed alongside each other in biographies of her, but they're not in the same source. So what the heck? They're in two completely different pieces. And then I came across some crumpled paper images. These are what were called suitcase arias. These were items that divas particularly enjoyed performing, that they would take with them from place to place to be inserted into whatever other larger work they were doing. So this is one of Faustina's suitcase arias, as best I can tell, based on the crumpled paper.